Hello, good evening and welcome to the TNT show. My name is John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. I need to begin with a point of information if you don't mind. We've had some feedback that suggests that not everyone is completely au fait with the term devil's advocate. The reason it's important to stress that that's the approach that most interviewers take, it's probably well worth underscoring the fact that I ask questions not necessarily based upon my own views, but rather to encourage the interviewee to cover the points in sufficient detail so that they carry conviction as well as information and as well as sentiment. So therefore, it's my job to ask questions that might sound provocative and might sound as if I have a very detached view on matters. That's not true, as anyone who knows me will tell you. So I wanted to make that clear right from the get-go, just in case there's anyone out there who thinks, gracious, that was an awfully aggressive way to put that point. That's my job. And if you watch any decent interviewer, by and large, they tend to be, if there is a buzz, they're slightly on that side of it, of being slightly more assertive than most people would be in a normal conversation. That's why it just comes across better in this rather artificial environment. So that's that. I see many of you are joining us tonight. I'm delighted to see that. And the main reason is that we have a great guest tonight. He's an old friend of mine. I don't mean he's old. I mean that he and I have been friends for a long time. We've been friends for a very good reason, is that we take a somewhat similar view on how important it is if a state is to be independent, that it has a set of rules and regulations or a means of expressing itself that other people can understand, particularly those who might not be in favour of constitutional change. And by the way, that's really what independence is. Independence is all about a constitutional change. And Elliot and I, off and on, have been working on constitutions. Why? Well, because shortened to almost an absurdity, a constitution tells everyone what a state or a country stands for and what it will not stand for. Okay? So anyone who's been watching what's happening in the United States just now with Donald Trump, who decided because he got the role of president, he can effectively abandon the Constitution. And meanwhile, there's other people there telling him that, I'm sorry, you're as bound by the Constitution as the local road sweeper is. That's the nature of constitutions. No one is above constitutions. And the reason the Americans went down that route is because they absolutely loathed the idea of having a king. They didn't really want anyone in charge who was persuaded that he was the font of all knowledge and power. And they were very distrustful of that. So you can imagine how they felt when Donald Trump decided himself as king at the very early stages of his second term in office. So there we are, a bit of background and a bit of content for this. But the real content is coming up. And I really don't want you to miss this, please, because this is hugely important. And if you get a chance to record this and keep it for later, then please do so, because I think the show is going to be helpful as we try and tease our way through a very changed environment. So without any further ado, let me introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Elliot Bulmer. Hi, Elliot. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm very well, thank you.
A great pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Where are you joining us from tonight?
I'm in very sunny and quite balmy Dunblane.
Now, these are not adjectives that necessarily go together very often, so let's rejoice.
Indeed, we're being very lucky with the weather in Dunblane today. So long may it may continue.
And here's other good news. I gather you've got a book coming out soon. It's called The English Constitution.
That's right, John. So as many listeners and viewers will know, I've written a lot about a constitution for Scotland and constitution building in the context of transition to an independent Scottish state. I've written in total 3 books about the Scottish dimension to a constitutional question. And it became apparent to me that the constitutional conversation in Scotland was actually quite sophisticated and quite advanced, that people have been aware of the need for a constitution. The Scottish government has made a commitment to a constitution, but the conversation in England was a long way off from that. And so I started, it was actually a few years ago. I was a lecturer in politics at the University of Dundee. I just had a book out on the Westminster Model around the world and the sort of influence of the Commonwealth on the development of constitutionalism. And I was looking for a new research project. And that materialized as this book, which is an attempt to take the constitution, i.e. the lack of a written constitution and the need to build a constitution, seriously in an English as well as a Scottish context. So I've always presented myself in a sense as a sort of post-unionist, but rather than necessarily as a nationalist in that sense, in as much as I think it's clear that present constitutional arrangements and the structure of the United Kingdom as it currently exists is not really serving the public interest on either side of the border. And therefore, if we want to advance that conversation and think about what kind of state we need, then that conversation also has to take place on both sides of the border. And I wanted in some ways to investigate the question of, well, what would an England look like if England was no longer the core of this sort of British imperial state or post-imperial state, but actually could come to terms with itself. And this is another aspect in which the English conversation, I think, is a long way behind the Scottish conversation. I say sometimes that the sort of English conversation is a little bit in its Kailyard stage. If you think of the sort of the Kailyard literature in which Scotland tried to sort of reconnect with its own sort of deep identity in a pre-political sense, before the movement towards political autonomy came about. I think England is at that stage. When I look at the literature, and it's been a fascinating couple of years of diving quite deeply into the literature about England and Englishness and English national identity, English history, myths, folklore, religion, all of the things that sort of make England England. That is at its pre-political stage, but I think it's about to become political.
It's interesting to say that, because we've interviewed a whole bunch of very nice academics from south of the border on the show, and what strikes me very forcibly is so many of them will say things like, chiming much with what you've just said, that England is sort of run from the southeast, there's a sort of radius of about maybe 10, 20 miles around the city of London and Westminster and Whitehall. And the folks within that charm circle have their needs met as best as can be achieved, but everyone else can go hang. There isn't really, in that sense, an English state so much as a sort of core that looks after itself, and it's self-perpetuating. For example, I'm very struck now that I spend a lot of time outside the UK, how few regional voices are on the mainstream media. It's very rare. Unless it's a very narrow discipline like sport, and then it seems to be allowed, but not, by no means, never, in fact, Do you hear regional accents on news programmes or political programmes? I mean, you might get the occasional Labour politician who doesn't sound as if he comes from the southeast, but the leadership, by and large, tend to sort of ape that world view. And the other thing that people have told us who are concerned about this and who identified this is they're concerned that there is a growing appetite, but not significant. Would you agree with that for constitutional change south of the border?
So I think there is a growing appetite for constitutional change. I don't think it's expressing itself as such. People don't necessarily, outside of a few, people who are really into this sort of thing, people don't sit there thinking, oh, what we need is a new constitutional settlement to reconnect the relationship between the state and the citizen and to reaffirm national identity in a way that is, constructive and serves the common good. That's not where the conversation is. What people say is, I'm sick of the lot of you. I don't trust any of you with my children's future. Everything's broken and I don't know what's happened. And I think that what we're seeing is a lot of alienation, anger, a sense of dispossession, because those structures have broken down. And I take quite a long view of this. I argue that the Union state, which came out of the long 17th century and that was sort of formed by the Union and by, ultimately a long period of quite bloody civil war and civil strife in order to consolidate this state. That state was an 18th century product, and I think you can really look at a period from, say, the Battle of Culloden through to the handover of Hong Kong as a kind of period during which the British imperial state gained world power and then lost world power, but it did so under quite stable institutions. Those institutions were able to gradually adapt. There was a gradual expansion of the suffrage, but essentially you could take someone from the 1750s and someone from the 1990s and look at the institutions of the British state and they would be quite familiar to them.
Yeah.
And that was a state which had a purpose, right? It was the foundation of a mercantile, commercial, imperial state from which some people benefited enormously and which became for a while the most powerful state on earth, and had an internal logic to it. And if you look at the institutions of the British state and you see it through that lens, there was a coherence to the way in which things were done.
Mm-hmm.
Without an empire, what is the purpose of that state? You needed the Union state to provide the internal security against French invasion that enabled then outwards expansion.
Yeah.
Once the empire's gone, without a British empire, what are you left with? And this was a problem that actually arose after the Second World War. And what you see after the Second World War is a new thing, which is the emergence of a British national identity. Up until that point, everybody was quite happy to talk about Scottish and English and Welsh and Irish as national identities within an imperial British state. After that time, you start to get this idea of a British national identity, which is really a Labour project. The Conservatives get on board with it as well when it becomes inevitable. The problem with that is that you can have a Scottish nation and an English nation and a Welsh nation within a British Empire. But if Scotland and Wales become regions within a British nation, then that challenges national identities in a very new way. And I think it's no coincidence in a way that once you get this shift towards this idea of a British nation, after the Second World War, that's when you start to get the rise of Scottish and Welsh nationalisms in the 1960s, following on from that, because those national identities suddenly become threatened by a British nation in a way that they were never quite threatened by a British Empire.
Yeah.
The problem is that England completely subsumed itself within that British imperial state.
Yeah.
And you're right, when you think, for most of the ruling class and the people who actually held power, it wasn't run by England. The English people, the sort of pink-gutted, pork-eating, beer-drinking sort of Englishry, it was never their state. It was always a state of a ruling class, of an elite, of an aristocracy and a commercial class who formed that sort of imperial elite. And so the England that has kind of come down into the cultural memory actually has very little to do with the land and the culture that exists between the River Tweed and the English Channel.
Yeah, I think that's borne out. I mean, I've got this rather interesting book here, which I do recommend. It makes for interesting reading, and there's a section in here, page 55, in which the researchers seek to establish what the differences are between being British and being English, and it speaks to some of your comments. In a way, it says, for example, the English identifiers are more likely to cite the Queen, literature, sacrifices in world wars, and the countryside, whereas those who identify as British identify they're being proud of openness to other cultures and faiths, as well as shared institutions such as the NHS.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that reflects the fact that, Britishness as a national identity was always a project of the Labour Party. Whereas the Conservatives were, for a long time and until quite recently, much more comfortable with expressing an English identity, even if it was a kind of British imperial version of Englishness, that was at home in around the world under tropical climes as much as it was at home. But I think you're right that the markers of Englishness and Britishness have become politicized. Britishness being associated with a sort of 2012 kind of moment with the Olympics and that sort of kind of modernist sort of steel plate and glass Britishness. Yeah. Whereas I think what's interesting about Englishness is that it is an identity that's really rooted in a vision of the past.
Yeah.
Because in itself, it's also a dispossession, right? That we, and I've said a lot about this, about the nature of British imperial rule in Scotland and how, some people did very well out of that, but Scotland as a nation, not necessarily. And I think the same is true, actually, of England, that the British imperial state also didn't actually serve the interests of England as a place and as a people very well.
That's interesting, because that's borne out again by this research. I mean, the research makes it clear, for example, that people who identify as British are much more comfortable with Scottish devolution and, to some extent, comfortable with independence compared to people who identify as English. And there seems to be some sort of rather strange lack of crossover in a way. I mean, this notion of Spitfires and it seems to be terribly important to some people. It also affects views on European integration to a large degree. I mean, people who identify as English are much more hostile towards any form of European integration than people who identify as British.
That's right. I mean, I draw on that. It's a very good book, by the way, the one that you're holding. It's got a lot of crunchy numbers in it, and it's something that I use as one of my main sources of empirical data in producing this book, which is more of a sort of analysis and reflection. You're right. The English identity has become right coded, and British identity has become sort of centrist coded, if not left coded. But the difficulty that I'm trying to reach is to say, well, how is it that people who identify as English are more hostile to devolution and more hostile to Scottish independence than people who identify as British? That would seem to be a contradiction. And a concept put forward by John Denham, who was a former Labour MP, I think is quite helpful in unpacking that, because he talks about this idea of Anglo-centric British unionism. So the English identifiers see British rule over Scotland and Wales not as a sharing of power with equal nations, but as a form of domination. So they do not see the Union as threatening their Englishness, but rather as a projection of their Englishness. And this creates a great problem because we are dealing with a right-leaning English national identity which does not want an independent England. It wants an imperial England that is able to dominate the countries that it sees as within its sphere of influence. And part of my purpose in writing this book is to try to engage with English nationalism and just try to say to people who do care about England and who do want to talk about an English identity, say to people, what would it look like if that English identity were not expressed through a British imperial state, but actually through an English state that is kind of comfortable with itself? What does it look like and feel like to have a post-British England? And I don't think many people have started to ask that question yet. And if that question is not asked, then Scottish independence is a threat to the English's own sense of British identity. I'm very carefully passing all my words here, right? Scottish independence is a threat to English people's sense of Britishness.
You're right. I mean, it does seem a contradiction that people who want their own parliament would not want it for other people. You would think on the face of it that would be a logical extension. But tell us this great story about what the book stemmed from in 2018 when you went around the cathedral cities and the effect it had on you.
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, I started the book in actually the January of 2021 is when I really started sort of researching it. But the germ of the idea came to me a little earlier in December of 2018. I'd been working on a UN project in Tuvalu for a while, a small island nation in the South Pacific, working on their constitutional reform. And I had about a month's leave after that. And I decided that I actually didn't know England very well. I mean, as I always say, despite my accent, I have spent all my adult life really either in Scotland or abroad. So I thought I'll go and sort of go looking for England, in search of England in J.B. Priestley's name of J.B. Priestley's book. And so I did a little tour. It was during Advent. So a little tour of English cathedral cities. And I went to some beautiful places, Salisbury and Hereford and Wells, all these sort of beautiful chocolate box kind of quintessential quaintshire English places. And I was just a bit shocked how, even in a sense, in the nice bits of England, how run down things were, the lack of public infrastructure. Having previously worked in the Netherlands, just everything seemed dirty and shabby and run down. And I thought, good grief, if this is what the supposedly nice bits are like, that England shows as its face to tourists, what's the rest of the country like? And that then got me thinking about the territorial distribution of power within England and the psychogeography of England, like how English elites think of their own geography. And we must again reflect on the fact that for many of those Anglo-British elites who ran the British Empire, England was glimpsed briefly from the nursery window or from behind the walls of one of the elite public schools, or from the green of an Oxbridge college, maybe out of the windows of a London club. But actually that connection between the imperial ruling class and England as a real place was actually pretty tenuous. It was fascinating because I went on a deep dive into a whole range of things where, as a constitutional scholar, I had not gone before, looking into a lot of literature and folklore and all of those kinds of things, to see how that imperial ruling class almost found the sort of the rustic tribes of England just as foreign and just as exotic and just as subject to a kind of paternalistic rule as they did the nations that they discovered, elsewhere in the empire. There is still, I was very influenced by James Hawes's book, where he talks about the shortest history of England, where he talks about this sort of ongoing cultural gulf between what he calls Saxon and Norman, and they're not really sort of ethnic markers of descent, but they're cultural markers, right? The beer swilling Saxon and the wine quaffing Norman are still kind of clear cultural class-based stereotypes. And I think a lot of our politics in the UK now is really driven by the anger of what you might call that Saxon demographic, who feel that their Norman ruling class has let them down. Again. And I think you can almost see Brexit in that way. I've spent a lot of time looking at Brexit. I don't think it had anything to do with the European Union. I don't think it had anything to do really even with immigration in the strict sense of the word, or certainly in terms of freedom of movement within the European Union. I think what it had much more to do with was a sense by that, if you like, Saxon Englishry, that they were not listened to or heard or cared about by that sort of, if you want to call it, Normanized ruling class. And so you almost can see Nigel Farage as a sort of Herod the Wake. Now I think it's a fake form of
it's a stretch, but there you are.
But I don't really think he has those interests at heart.
Yeah.
But rhetorically and stylistically, this is a man who is always seen with a pint of English beer in his hand, never a glass of French wine. and
Even though he doesn't have a British passport, his children aren't British in the accepted sense. I think he's actually, his home is in France or Belgium or somewhere. I can't remember. So he's a sort of stereotype, but he plays to the stereotype very well. And I think the BBC panders to that. I think the BBC, a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, look at this, is dreadful that the BBC is bending over backwards to connect with Farage." I think they're bending over backwards because it's a whole bunch of public school boys who've never been outside, the M25. Suddenly finding out there's a whole part of England out there about which they know nothing, and they see Farage and they think, "Oh, here's a sort of a way of connecting to that very angry bunch of people." And if we can connect to these angry people, they'll continue to watch our television shows. I don't think it's any more complicated than that. It's the BBC miscalculating yet again because so many of its executives have no understanding of what happens outside the M25. But
I think you're right, John. I was just going to say that I would put it even perhaps in starker terms than that. They're scared of the natives.
Yeah.
And I think you can put a lot of sort of what's gone wrong with the polarization of politics down to this fact that it almost feels like a decolonization moment. In as much as, I spent a lot of time looking at sort of late imperial, early Commonwealth history and that transition to independence, because I've been thinking about that in terms of Scotland's transition to independence. But there comes a moment when the moral authority of imperial rule, which for a long time was actually quite strong, is suddenly undermined. And then the politics runs away and the imperial sort of establishment loses its grip. And it almost looks a little bit like that, where the natives are rebelling. Now, I don't think they're very well led, and I think they're rebelling in ways that are probably not going to do them any good, because for all the reasons that go almost without saying. But that sense of loss of grip, I think, is quite palpable. And this is where, in some ways, the radical right is quite different from the traditional establishment right. They don't have a lot of respect for institutions. They don't necessarily identify with, the crown and the monarchy and all those things that held the British imperial state together. It's a much more ethnocultural identity. But nobody other than the far right is speaking into that space. And so it's almost an own goal in a way.
Yeah.
Just because the liberal establishment, if you want to call it that, the centrist establishment, the London establishment, doesn't connect. It tries sometimes, and it thinks that the way to pander is in policy terms, i.e. give them a harsher immigration policy, or, crack down on knife crime or something like that. They think that is the way of connecting. I don't think it is, because I don't think those policy preferences are actually those right-wing policy preferences that are coming out of people like Reform. I think that is something that the right-wing leadership is inserting into that audience. I think what the audience is really concerned about is a much more existential question of who are we?
Yeah.
Right? And what does it mean to be English in a world where the British Empire is no longer a thing? Yeah. And in the same way that Scotland has to ask itself questions about who are we, what do we stand for, what do we not stand for, how should we govern ourselves, what's our place in the world, I think England also needs to ask itself those same questions. And at the moment, the only people who are speaking into that are the reactionary populist right.
Yeah. It's a good point. If people want to get a copy of your book, Elliot, when it's published, how do they do that?
It's published by Manchester University Press. It's coming out in September, so you have a wee wait yet. I can't offer it to you for summer reading, unfortunately, but it will be out in September. You can order it from the Manchester University Press website
Good.
or from anywhere that good books are sold.
Good. Well, I hope everyone will rush out to the bookstores and get a copy, because it's through understanding the people that we share this island with that we get a better way to move forward, I think, by and large. Let's talk about, we've talked about the English Constitution, we've talked about Englishness. Let's talk about where Scotland is going from here. And we've had a bunch of questions, people suggesting conventions, other people saying maybe we could learn from Irish history, maybe we should reform some treaty with France. Why don't all the Celtic nations, the Celtic nations, go to the UN to talk about the way forward? And will Ireland be united before Scotland goes? And Charles Smith is saying maybe constitutional politics will become history as per the current situation in the USA. I'm not sure that's an entirely accurate analysis of what's happening there. And somebody says, can't we just rip up the Scotland Act? Well, that's a great melange of different views there. But if you can perhaps give us a response to some of those. I mean, essentially what people are asking is, where does independence go from here, in your view?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And if you'd asked me that question a couple of years ago, it was fairly clear what the plan was, right? That there was going to be another independence referendum. The political pressure of that referendum would force the British government to honour once again the terms of the agreement that were made back in 2012, and that there was a fairly clear path to independence should people wish to take it. The Supreme Court decision in 2022 really blocked that road, because it became clear that the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, could not hold a referendum on independence on its own. And therefore, the decision to hold an independence referendum would require the approval of the UK Parliament. Now, in itself, that's no obstacle, right? The Scottish government has a majority in the Scottish Parliament for independence. It writes to the British government and says, dear Sir Keir, we would like to hold a referendum on independence. Here is our democratic mandate. We trust that you will, in accordance with long-standing convention, respect that mandate. Please introduce a Scotland Independence Bill or a Section 30 order to enable us to hold that referendum. And then we can all proceed in a mature, grown-up, sensible, peaceful, democratic way. And we maintain good relationships north and south of the border, and we go forward to address our common concerns as two equal independent nations. Unfortunately, to get to the point at which that can happen requires some shift of mentality and mindset and decision-making south of the border. Part of my concern is that if a British government sees Scottish independence as an electoral threat, then they won't allow it. If the English electorate is very open-minded about Scottish independence because they're coming to terms with their own Englishness, then maybe that opens the way. That's my first comment. Second comment is that what follows from that is that we are, we're all stuck. And it reminds me actually a little bit of the last days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where nobody really wanted the status quo, but nobody really had a way out of it either. And so the whole thing just kind of staggered along. And I fear that we're in the sort of staggering along stage of that British imperial state. And therefore, we do need to have a conversation in which we say, okay, Scotland's conversation has to work with the conversation in Wales. The Labour Party in Wales signed up to a document that included independence as an option. Why are they able to do that in Wales when they're not able to do that in Scotland? Because the conversations are different. What could those conversations learn from each other? Excuse me. There's also the sort of geostrategic reason. I went recently to a conference of the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, and I had a very good presentation by Jim Sillars, in which he said, look, Scotland has always been, since the early Middle Ages, in England's sphere of influence. And that would be true even after independence. Even after independence, England and Scotland would have to learn to work together and to live together. And that relationship can be kind of like the relationship between, this is my words now, not Jim Sillars' words, but that can be a relationship a bit like that between New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah.
Right? It could also, if we don't do this well, be a bit like the relationship between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
So Scotland's long-term security and future depends not just on getting independence, but on getting independence in a way that England can live with. So I think we do need to have a cross-border conversation now. Whereas I would have thought a few years ago that this is a Scottish matter, it's an internal Scottish matter, it's a Scottish conversation. Scotland comes to its decision and the British government just has to respect it. Well, yes, as a moral point, they probably do just have to respect it. As a democratic point, they do. But the realistic politics of that are, if we want them to respect it, then we need to have a conversation that is also taking place south of the border.
Okay.
For example, I find it fascinating that the progressive left in England is completely happy with the idea of Irish reunification and Irish independence. Labour politicians have no problem with that. But somehow Scottish independence is a stumbling block. Well, let's have that conversation. Why is it that they feel that? And I think part of it is, as I said, Britishness is a Labour project, and they are uncomfortable with an English national identity. And what's frightening at an existential level about Scottish independence is that it forces British people in England to come to terms with their own Englishness, and they're not yet ready to do that.
Yeah. That's my sense of it too, and that's come through in a whole range of interviews. You were at the SSRG. One of the outcomes of that has been a visit to the United Nations to deal with anti-colonialism, because it's deemed that Scotland is a colony of Britain. And therefore, it's up to United Nations to come to a view on this. What is your take on that?
I'm pretty skeptical of those kind of moves, to be honest. I understand why people are doing it, because, as I say, up to a couple of years ago, it felt that independence was quite imminent and that there was a very clear binary choice. And now we're kind of stuck going around in circles. And I think we may be actually further away from independence than we were a few years ago. Partly that's because of the changed internal politics of Scotland. Partly that's because of the wider global geopolitics and the sort of more hostile international environment. So I can understand why people faced with this think, well, what's the shortcut? What's the way that forces this open? And they think the UN is a way. I don't have as much faith in international organizations as that. I mean, I've done work for the UN, I don't think that there's any sort of international law or international organization that comes in like a knight in shining armor and is going to lift a finger to rescue Scotland. It just doesn't. The world doesn't work that way. I'm very sorry. Maybe it would be better if it did, but it doesn't. So at best, I see it as a waste of time and a red herring. At worst, I see it as actually a setback because it is a distraction from the real work that needs to be done, which is a constitutional conversation about how the various peoples on these islands are going to live together in the future.
Well, you talked about conversations across the border. There isn't even a conversation taking place in Scotland across the parties. I mean, and when we interviewed Stephen Flynn, for whom I have an enormous respect, he said, yes, the SNP's policy was to have a convention and get people together, and that was planned. I said, who's doing it within the SNP? And he couldn't tell me. He said, but we will get back to you. And that's never happened. And that's been almost a year now. So I get the impression that the SNP is not at all enthusiastic about getting together with anyone, frankly. And that's rather sad, because if, as you say, there'll be a need to work across the border, it would be very helpful if at least we could work together within Scotland. And this takes me back to something I've been concerned about for some time, and that's the role of the First Minister in moving this issue of independence forward. My impression is that he is very comfortable dealing with nuts and bolts of the present settlement, but is not, despite rhetoric, is not hugely enthusiastic about changing that in any way. I hope I'm wrong here, but that's my impression. Do you think that's a mistaken view?
I wish I did, John. I wish I did think it was a mistaken view. And I think you're not alone in that view. I mean, part of the difficulty is that the burdens of day-to-day office, and let's face it, the SNP have not done a bad job of running a devolved administration. People can quibble about various things, but it's at least the least bad government that Scotland has had for 300 years. And there are a number of aspects of day-to-day life that are better in Scotland now, thanks to the fact that there's been an SNP government, which we wouldn't have had any other government been in power. So credit where it's due. However, every national movement, I think, has to take strategic decisions about whether they're going to be a regionalist party or an independence party, and to what extent they're going to accommodate themselves to the existing constitutional structures, and to what extent they're going to change those structures. I don't see a lot of appetite or capacity to change, and part of that is a lack of constitutional information. I don't think they've really understood that creating an independent state is a constitution building process, that you're changing the fundamental structure of the state. And that's a sort of leap from an old way of being to a new way of being that I just don't think they've really grasped. Partly, I think that's just because they're overburdened with the day-to-day and they're not able to get strategic thinking. Partly, it might be that, they recognize the scale of this task. It's a really big thing to do. It's not insurmountable. Country can do it. But you need systematic long-term planning. You need to think about these different sectors. Brexit has showed us the folly of doing something emotively without having done your homework first. Where's the body that's doing that homework? Well, there's the white paper series. And full disclosure, I contributed to the white paper on the Constitution, and I actually found that the people that I was working with there were pretty good in terms of understanding a little bit more than they had in the past about what the Constitution was for and why this was so central to the process. But we would need to do that for defence, for international affairs, for passports, for all the transitional arrangements need to be put in place. Currency. There's never been an attempt to really found a well-funded, well-staffed body that is sufficiently independent from the sort of short-term thinking of day-to-day party politics that can do that work. And I would have thought that if I were the SNP leader and if I were the first, and I really committed to the idea of an independent Scotland, then I would be putting some significant resources into doing that work and coming up with a plan. Are
you okay?
Yeah, I just lost you for a second. Your screen went blank on me, but I think
what's happening is that somebody in your home is downloading something. I suspect using up most of your bandwidth.
Probably. So where was I saying? Yes, they're not doing that work. Now, the idea of a convention is a good idea, right? I think we've moved, unfortunately, I think we've moved on from the point where there's a momentum to say we're going to have this we're going to hold a convention, we're going to put that to. I don't see a leadership that's willing to engage actually in that sort of challenge and brinkmanship to the British state. So what's the alternative to that challenge and brinkmanship? Well, the alternative is negotiation. And as somebody made the comment earlier, they don't see Scotland as an equal to negotiating partner. Well, they didn't see Ireland as an equal negotiating partner either, and they did negotiate, and the Anglo came out of that, etc. So I think there has to be some willingness to move the conversation on. Now, I'm going to say something next, John, that's going to be absolutely shocking and might alienate half your audience. I'm not sure, not as sure as I was a few years ago, that independence is the next step. And I'm also no longer convinced that the binary yes, no, independence versus unionist sort of bifurcation of Scottish politics is actually doing us any favours.
Yeah.
I think that part of the constitutional conversation that we should be having now is a little bit different, which is to say, what kind of arrangement is not just going to win a majority 50-50, but what kind of arrangement can actually command over the medium term broad consensus, and what kind of arrangement gets us further down a path so that if we choose to have independence in the future, A, we have a right to it, then B, we have a firmer basis institutionally from which to achieve it.
Now, you produced a paper on this called Secure Autonomy.
Many years ago. That was thinking about 2012 when the Scottish government had its national conversation, maybe even a little earlier. And then once we had the Edinburgh Agreement and the commitment to a referendum, then there was a sort of clear sort of demarcation. It was going to be in or out, yes or no, independence or bust kind of arrangement. We chose bust. I think that was a mistake. But maybe now we are no longer in that era that we were from, say, 2012 to 2022. And actually we're in an era that is going to look a little bit more like the 2007 to 2012 era, i.e. an exploration of different models and different possibilities.
Yeah.
And to go back to that secure autonomy model, I mean, what I'm talking about there is something that looks a little bit like the arrangement that the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands have, where they have essentially all the substance of internal independence or internal autonomy, except for things like foreign affairs and defence. And so there would still be a British Army, there would still be a Royal Navy, there would still be a British passport, there would still be British embassies, there may even still be a sterling union. Yeah. But there would be a Scotland that is not represented in Westminster, that isn't subject to the British government for its internal affairs, and that has full autonomy over its own taxing and spending.
Yeah.
Now, that's not something that I'm saying is like, that's my hard policy preference. But I do think, in answer to your original question, where do we go from here? I think we need to go back to be willing to have that discussion about various intermediate models and gradualism. And that's the only way that I can see that we can break down some of the polarization.
Or maybe what we want to do is to acquaint people in England with secure autonomy. And they might find that a good option. When I think of when I think of sorry, you're breaking up a lot, Elliot. You're frozen completely. You have somebody at home who's using an enormous amount of bandwidth. You're frozen completely. Yeah, we lost you, I guess. I'm just not sure. We'll give it a couple of minutes, folks, to see if Elliot's... no, he's gone completely. Yeah, no worries. We're almost at the hour mark anyway. Oh, you're back.
You're gone. I'm here, John.
Yeah, I think somebody at home is using.
You don't get rid of me that easily, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're almost at the end of our time anyway, Elliot.
Probably my.
My own
yeah,
sense.
No, I was just going to say that.
Yeah, fire away.
I was just going to say, in relation to your point about acquainting England with secure autonomy. Well, I think that's part of what this book is actually trying to achieve, which is to say, is it possible to come up with different types of arrangements that, because it recognizes an English state, is also able to recognize a Scottish state and a Welsh state, while still maintaining some sort of connection between those for those to whom that is important. And at least to have that conversation, and that's all I'm putting forward at this point.
I think that's probably right, and I think and maybe that it would be ironic in some senses that if your secure autonomy paper produced all these years ago resonated south of the border before it resonated north of the border, but stranger things have happened. I wish it, and I wish your book on the English Constitution every success. And just one last thought. I've been reading this interesting book here on the tyranny of the minority. It's about the United States and Trump. But they talk about a concept which might apply to the First Minister and to lots of the Scottish political establishment. It's called learned helplessness. It's this notion that over a period of time, you can train people to feel helpless. You can encourage them not to kick over the traces. You can encourage them to be content, by and large, with their present circumstances. And they call it learned helplessness. I hope I'm wrong. But anyway. So we've run out of time. I need to say thank you, and I want to say thank you. And I think it's been very entertaining. I think you've stirred up a hornet's nest, which is fantastic. And I hope once the book is published, you'll come back and tell us what the reaction has been, and maybe suggest some ways forward that people haven't thought about towards independence or a complete change in the Constitution. Elliot, thank you again. Much appreciated.
It's been a pleasure.
And take care, and speak to you soon.
Yeah. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks again. And a big thank you to everyone watching and listening tonight. Take care, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week at 7 o'clock. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, look after each other. Good night.